Okay, hello everybody. So I think we are live with you. My name is Jo White. I'm a clinical psychologist and advanced certified schema therapist. I'm based in the UK, where I've got my own independent practice. I offer schema therapy, I supervise psychologists, and I also offer some training workshops. And I'm really pleased to be here with my lovely friend and colleague, Kate. Would you like to introduce yourself, Kate?
Yeah, thanks, Jo. It's great to be here. I'm Kate Williams. I'm also a clinical psychologist and advanced schema therapist based in the UK. I offer individual schema therapy, supervision, workshops and teaching related to schema therapy. And I think you and I, Jo, we've known each other for 15 years and working together and having the lovely privilege to think about schema together over the years. So yeah, it's great to be here talking about the guilt-induced critic.
Yeah, thanks, Kate. So today we're going to spend a bit of time thinking about the guilt-inducing critic mode with you, which is a rarely taught mode actually in standard schema training. And so we hope to help you know what to look out for so that you can spot the guilt-inducing critic whilst you're working with your clients. And we'll share some examples of our clinical practice when thinking about the potential origins for this mode. And we're going to give you some ideas about how to work with the guilt-inducing critic mode when you're doing imagery rescripting. So, Kate, do you want to kick off with helping us think about what the guilt-inducing critic mode looks like?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, I think I would have really valued this really early on in my schema therapy career because I think I was much less familiar with the guilt-induced critic. And at times, I don't really think I considered it, and I might have mistook it to be a demanding critic, which is a little bit problematic, as we'll talk about a little bit later on. The demanding critic is different to the guilt-induced critic, and as a consequence, the guilt-induced critic does need a slightly different approach. So the guilt-induced critic, it puts pressure on the individual to always prioritize the needs and emotions of other people over their own. When the individual doesn't do this well enough, or they just don't do it at all, they observe other people to experience difficult emotions and distress, and as a consequence of an action they've taken, they'll feel guilty, low and anxious as a result of this. So guilt is the main feeling that's activated by this critic mode, and this guilt can be either imagined guilt when the person considers not meeting the needs of another, or real guilt and huge anxiety when someone's upset and they perceive they've been the cause of it.
Thanks for those points. So kind of thinking, as Kate was earlier, around the demanding critic and how it can be a bit confusing. That's because the guilt-inducing critic has very strong demanding elements to it as well. So it's got very high expectations, a sense that you always have to meet other people's needs and protect other people from experiencing difficult emotions. So I was thinking, a healthy adult perspective is recognizes and accepts that actually we might disappoint other people. We might let other people down when we need to prioritize our own needs. But the healthy adult perspective is accepting of that. So, for example, if somebody was asked to run an errand and actually they needed to prioritize whatever they had to do that day and they weren't able to run the errand for their friend, the healthy adult mode would be accepting that actually the friend might be a bit disappointed, but that's okay. If somebody's got a guilt-inducing critic mode, then they might feel like they can absolutely never upset anybody else. They can't disappoint anybody else. And so they would prioritize running those errands, even if it has significant consequences on their own needs being met.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know we arranged to do this talk at a different time, didn't we, Jo, originally? Not that other people are aware. And I know that my own guilt-induced critic was really strongly activated when I had to speak to Jo and say, no, I can't do that time. So my healthy adult definitely stepped in and we were able to have a conversation where it's absolutely fine. And yeah, we rearranged it to this time. But yeah, no, you're absolutely right, Jo. And an individual's worth is likely to be really heavily linked to meeting the needs of others. So they feel really good, they feel positive when they meet the demands of the critic, but extreme levels of guilt and a sense of just feeling really incapable when they do not. So when that critic mode gets activated, it can leave the individual feeling really guilty, really bad, and just unworthy.
Yeah. And so another sign that the guilt-inducing critic might be there could be a very much suppressed angry child mode in your client, as the individual's needs frequently get overlooked. They're not seen at all because of the power of the guilt-inducing critic saying that actually their needs aren't important. So these individuals can feel very guilty about expressing their needs openly because they're worried about upsetting other people. But the anger can still seep out, but in a much more passive way. So, for example, someone who might have been upset by their friend and can't then tell their friend how they feel because they don't feel like their needs should be prioritized over their friend's emotions. But actually the frustration kind of comes out anyway. Maybe the friend acts in a bit of a frosty or a distant manner as a result of their suppressed anger. So what sort of patterns in childhood lead to these guilt-inducing messages? So we're going to have a think about some of our some examples that we can give from our clinical practice to help to make sense of how a guilt-inducing critic might develop for somebody. So I was having a think about a pattern developing in childhood where the child ends up taking responsibility for managing their parents' feelings. Often it's a parent. So that's the example that I'm using here. So I've had situations where with my adult clients, when they were children, they were a go-between between their mum and dad when they've split up. And the parent, one of the parents is trying to glean information from the child about what the other parent has said about them, what they've been doing. And the child is under pressure to share information with that one parent. And perhaps a sensitive child might really notice that when they share certain things with that parent, that the parent gets really upset about what they've shared. And then the child ends up feeling really worried and anxious about the parent because their distress ends up being overwhelming for the child. And so the child ends up feeling responsible as they've been the one to share the information with the parent. And so they start to think through really carefully what information they share, what they don't share. And the child's needs within that have been completely lost. And so sort of thinking about the features of that lead to the guilt-inducing critic, that maybe unintentionally, but sometimes intentionally, the child is given the message that their needs aren't important and that they're not the priority. The child is noticing that their actions or the things that they're saying are triggering distress in somebody else, and they're left feeling responsible for that. And another key feature is the parent's distress being overwhelming for the child. And so as an adult, that person is likely to be overthinking what they're sharing with their friends, looking out for signs that they've upset somebody. And their needs get totally lost again in the relationship as they work hard to make sure that they're meeting the needs of other people. And they might be really dependent on sort of praise and reassurance within the relationship to make sure that they're getting it right.
Yeah, no, that's a really good example, Jo, and it's definitely a pattern I've observed working with clients over time who've got a strong guilt-induced critic. I was also thinking about a pattern where the child has had to take excessive responsibility for the parents, and again, often it's parents, so I'll use the example of parents, where the child has had to take excessive responsibility for the parents' emotional and practical needs. And examples of this have been when the parent might have been physically unwell or had mental health difficulties. And in those types of situations, the child might have had to, either perceived directly or indirectly, they might have had to step in to prioritise the parent's needs in order to create safety, in order to maintain containment, or to establish some form of connection with the parent. And in order to do this, they ensure that the parents' needs are met before their own, or often, sometimes at the expense of their own. And in doing this, they might learn, and the examples that I've experienced, they might learn that they have to stay quiet, to be compliant, so as not to upset the parent, that sense of children should be seen and not heard. So really strong messages about, just make sure you behave. And the consequence of this is that it inhibits their ability to be spontaneous and playful. They might have strong messages, either directly or indirectly, which communicate very rigid expectations about how they need to behave in order to keep their parent happy and settled. Which means as an adult, they haven't had healthy exposure to developing their own sense of autonomy and self-expression, and perhaps come to believe that the only way to do it right is to do what's expected of them, so to behave in the way that other people expect them to. And this gets reinforced by the positive messages they get from their parent when they get it right. And again, it gets further reinforced that if they don't do it in that way, their parent gets distressed with them. And again, that might be subtle distress. It might be subtle messages like a roll of an eye, a sigh, or even silence. So over time, it just comes to be really reinforced. You need to behave in a certain way in order for the world to feel okay. And what that means as an adult, an individual can find it really hard to know how to make their own choices, their own decisions, without checking for signs that other people agree or they're happy with this. They're unlikely to develop a healthy sense of how to advocate for their own needs, to be assertive and express their own emotional needs, which might mean they might inhibit what spontaneously they would like to do or what they'd like to say for fear they might upset somebody. And guilt is the main feeling that gets activated whenever the individual attempts to take care of themselves. And I guess as I was writing this, and I've just mentioned earlier on, I've got a really strong guilt-induced critic, and I've absolutely been aware that as an adult, this gets activated for me when I've been in meetings where I've been required, it's part of my role to challenge, to disagree, to come up with an alternative opinion. And for me, that sense of that guilt-induced critic getting activated because I'm really aware I'm not agreeing with another person, or maybe I'm behaving in a way that somebody else doesn't want me to because I'm sort of perhaps upsetting the status quo, even though I recognise that's the healthy adult thing to do.
Yeah. Those are really good examples, Kate. And I was just thinking about how sometimes it's hard for our clients to know where the guilt-inducing critic has come from because of those sometimes implicit messages, like the roll of the eye, and often how that means that people are highly tuned in to watching other people's facial expressions and trying to work out how they're feeling. And I guess it's one of the reasons why imagery work is so helpful for the guilt-inducing critic, because it can really help us to identify where the critic mode has come from in the first place, when actually perhaps I don't know, with the punitive critic or the demanding critic, the messages that somebody has given might be more obvious, might be easier for us to identify and pinpoint and say, okay, this is where the critic mode has come from. Whereas it's less explicit with the guilt-inducing critic. So we're going to talk a little bit about imagery rescripting and share with you a few of the ideas that we have around how to use imagery rescripting with this critic mode, because it does need a different approach to the demanding critic and the punitive critic. Your aim is to help your clients to you're encouraging their self-expression. So you're encouraging them to share their needs and their emotions, and also to put carefully worded boundaries in place to stop the antagonist from placing responsibility onto the child for managing their own needs by themselves and for managing the needs of others. So Kate and I teach three main ways to sort of focus our attention in imagery rescripting. So we think about creating safety, and this is regardless of what the critic mode is, but creating safety, reparenting the child, and challenging the antagonist. So when it comes to creating safety with the guilt-inducing critic, often the main threats to safety are around abandonment, particularly emotional abandonment, where the parent gets so overwhelmed by their needs that they lose sight of what the child's needs are, and rejection, where somebody else is being critical of the child for not prioritizing the needs of others. For the child to feel safe in imagery, then we have to really carefully manage the dynamic between the child and the parent, if that's the appropriate person in the image, so that we don't leave the child feeling even more unsafe. For example, if we stop the child from supporting the parent, the child is likely to feel really worried about their parent and how they're going to manage their distress. So one of the ways to manage this is by letting the child know that you're going to organise some help and some support for their parent, if that's the appropriate person in the image. so that they don't need to be providing that support for them, so that they can let go of that responsibility, because actually somebody else is going to be there for the parent. I tend to advise against offering yourself as that support for the parent. Frequently, when there's a guilt-inducing critic mode, then the emotional deprivation schema is key for these clients. And so I think it's really important that you offer your whole self, all of your attention, and are clear that your priority is your client. And that you don't compromise that by saying that actually you'll offer care for the parent too. So I think that's one of the things that I would advise.
Absolutely, yeah. And I know that I've certainly suggested a very well-respected colleague to support the parent in imagery rescripting that I've done with people, and you're often the colleague I'm holding in mind thinking with a person about. So yeah, no, that's a really good point, Jo. So yeah, as Jo mentioned, reparenting the child is another really important intervention and thing that we think about within imagery. So as we've already discussed, in imagery rescripting, the aim is to encourage self-expression and autonomy, and put some really carefully worded boundaries in place to stop the critic placing responsibility on the child for their own emotional needs and the emotional needs of others. And there are a range of different reparative messages we could give to the child, but I'll highlight a couple. The first, it's really, really important, I guess, to highlight the responsibility of taking care of another person's feelings being just too big for a child. Imagery is a really great opportunity to help the child understand this really heavy weight, this really big burden. Many individuals will come to have accepted over kind of childhood into adulthood that, you know, it's just their role in the family. That's just what they do. And as we've already mentioned previously, some of the guilt-induced critic interactions might be quite subtle. So it might require a bit of psychoeducation to really support the individual to recognise this heavy burden, this heavy weight. So in imagery rescripting, I'd be looking to connect with a vulnerable child, and let's say their little child's Tommy. And I'd say something along the lines of, "Hey, little Tommy, how does it feel when you see mum so sad? Do those feelings go away? Do you need a break?" And I guess by asking those questions, you might help the individual just to start to recognise, yeah, no, this is really hard. I do this all the time. You know, yeah, maybe I do need a break. And then add in some validation, you know, and some meaning making. Yeah, you know, little Tommy, this is just too much for a child to manage. So starting to just really gently and sensitively help in an imagery rescripting exercise for the little child, the vulnerable child, to notice, you know, this really heavy burden, and being there in the image, you know, asking those questions and just sensitively recognizing with the vulnerable child, you know, this is too much. Another aim of the reparative messages, the reparenting, is to encourage the child to build motivation to step away from that responsibility that's been placed on them. Often we find that children who've been placed in this role will receive lots of love and praise when they prioritise the feelings of the guilt-induced critic. And if that's the case, they might find it really hard to let go of these responsibilities. It might have been the only time where they got that validation, that connection, that warmth, that safety. So as you can appreciate, it would be really hard for someone to think, yeah, I'm gonna do this differently. But you really want to start to help them recognise and know there's another way. So again, in the imagery rescripting, connecting with the vulnerable child and saying something along the lines of, or giving messages along the lines of, "Little Tommy, this is a really very, very heavy worry. You carry it around with you all the time, and it's just too big for a child. Adults have far more ways of being able to deal with these big worries. Let's get your dad some support so you just don't need to hold this all the time." You know, so those messages, it's too big, you know, really building that sense of I can step away from this, but also linking to what Jo said earlier as well, that safety, you know, that's recognizing we need to get some support for dad. So you're not just leaving that child worrying, well, if I stop doing this, what's going to happen for dad or whoever the parent was or whoever the guilt-induced critic is in that image. But it's also important, I guess, not to leave the individual feeling criticised for taking on all of that help and doing all of that support. So, you know, just subtly praising the little person, but highlighting alongside that the importance of stepping away. So you might give a message along the lines of, little Tommy, I think you're very grown up and clearly really helpful, but I also think it's really important for you to be able to enjoy not having to be a grown up and not having to think about other people all of the time. So I might give those messages and then, really check in and think about what the little person needs. And those messages might lead me in imagery rescripting to, I don't know, perhaps for little Tommy be going outside and playing football while dad's getting some help and support, or going and getting an ice cream together, whatever the vulnerable child is communicating they need. But something that allows them a reparative experience of, it's okay to get my parent, whoever it might be, the support, and I'm going to go off and be spontaneous, be playful, do what I need to do as a little child, and actually I should be doing the things a little child should be doing.
I really love those ideas, Kate. You're so good at those reparenting messages, and I really like the sort of it feels like kind of gentle negotiation with the individual around stepping away. I know how hard that was having a similar role when I was little, and how it felt really important and grown up to me to provide that role to a parent, and so it's hard when you're having that sort of taken away from you. And so it's really important, isn't it, that you go really gently and make sure that you're tuning in to what's going on for your client.
Absolutely. No, you're so right. And loads of messages in society as well about why it's so great to look after others. So you do have to be really sensitive around it, and start to help, recognizing there are alternatives, and that's okay. That's okay.
Yeah. So the final sort of area that we think about in regards to imagery rescripting, it's around challenging the antagonist, or the person who's explicitly or implicitly putting those messages onto the child, that pressure onto the child. I guess I use the term challenge really lightly here, because you need to go really gently. I guess in the same way that we're thinking about going gently with the child, we're also going really gently with the guilt-inducing antagonist, because otherwise you're really likely to evoke a protective response in the child, where their compassion and their empathy goes towards their parent, who you're challenging in some way, and they're then not able to think about their needs. And this is what you're trying to help them to do, is really tune into what their needs are, and what they need, from how they need their emotional needs to be attended to. So it's about going really gently, and I find that if I remember, okay, this is a brilliant place to use empathic confrontation, then that helps me to really balance up the way in which I'm challenging the pressure that's being put on the child. So I'll validate the pain and the trouble that the parent is struggling with, but I'll also put in a clear boundary to think with the critic about them stopping sharing the messages that they do with the child. So I might say something like, I really understand that you're going through a difficult time, and that you're struggling right now, but your feelings are too obvious for little Tommy. It's overwhelming for him to see you so upset. He gets really, really worried about you. Let's get you some help so that you can stop doing this. So being really clear that the boundaries around stopping, this is not okay to be sharing your emotions this way with a child, but also being gentle in that I understand that your struggles are really hard. So just helping the child, who's the one that's really listening to the messages, to understand that this is too much, this is too big a responsibility, that we can still be supportive of the parent, and there's still places that they can go and get support, but actually it's important that this pressure stops.
Absolutely. And it's that sense, isn't it, Jo? It's a really lovely description, that sense of being firm but kind. So, and I think, as I mentioned really early on in my schema therapy career, when I perhaps didn't realise it was really a guilt-induced critic, and I'd perhaps responded to it more as a demanding critic, I absolutely recognised that maybe some of my messages were probably too harsh, too much, and perhaps that's why the imagery wasn't as powerful a reparative experience as it could have been. So what feels really important is, just being attuned with your client, seeking that feedback, understanding, how does this sound? Because as you said, Jo, if you become too angry with the critic, or you're too harsh, or you're too firm, there's a risk your client's attention and compassion is going to go straight back to the critic, because that's what they've been primed to do. That's what they've always done. And then you're going to risk your imagery rescripting not being the corrective emotional experience you planned. So yeah, it's a fine balance, isn't it, Jo? You know, really holding in mind the critic's needs, but not prioritizing those over the vulnerable child's. But yeah, it really means that you have to do that very skillful empathic confrontation that you're absolutely brilliant at. So yeah, it's a lovely example.
I guess we're thinking about, you know, really tuning in to the feedback that you're getting throughout the imagery, you know, checking in with the child. How are they doing? How are these messages going down? How does it feel when I speak to your mum, to your dad in this way? And then adjusting depending on the feedback that you receive from the client, so that you're really tuning into what their needs are. So the messages are really reparative.
Absolutely.
So that's the end of our little presentation on the guilt-inducing critic mode. If you'd like to learn more about adapting imagery rescripting to tackle the guilt-inducing critic alongside the demanding and the punitive critic, then we would really love you to join us for our workshop in October. It's on the 21st of October and it's 9 till 5 UK time. It's really normal to feel anxious about how to approach imagery rescripting. And so if your critic mode gets in the way of you sharing this powerful method with your clients, then this is the workshop for you. We really focus on building your confidence and giving you ideas, lots of different ideas about how to manage the different critic modes and how to adapt your approach so that you can work with your clients confidently. We talk in depth about each of the critic modes and take you through our trusted process of attending to safety, of reparenting the child, and talking to the antagonist for each of the different modes. And alongside the workshop, I think Kate and I were maybe overcompensated slightly when we were planning and preparing for our workshop, because there's a 50-page critic workbook that comes along with the workshop that includes step-by-step guides and handouts for working with the critic in imagery. And so you go away armed with everything that you might need to tackle the critic mode.
Maybe a little bit of overcompensating, but actually one of the things we recognised when we'd learned about imagery scripting was something to really help you scaffold that learning and feel confident to, you know, start to put those things in practice. So I guess it's Jo and I learning from our experience and thinking about actually what would have helped us. So yeah, that's why we developed the workbook to go alongside our workshop. Yeah,
because I think we've had the experience, haven't we? We'll come away with slides and you go, okay, the slides have got these bullet points on, but I really can't remember exactly what I was meant to be doing.
I need a step-by-step guide.
Yeah. So we've got step-by-step guides for you, as well as handouts that you can share with clients, and additional exercises that we won't have time to focus on in the workshop. So we've got a special discount just for group members, which will be running from now until the end of Monday market, where you can get £20 off the price of the workshop. You can also buy the recording if the hours don't work for you. So I will put a link to the workshop sales in the comments below our video. So we hope you found this helpful. It's been really nice chatting to everybody, and we will be back again soon.
Yeah, thanks for having me, and it's been great to speak to you all.
Thanks,
Take
Kate.
care. Bye-bye.
Bye.